I'd like to ask the three panelists to please come to the stage, take your seats. As Bart mentioned, my name is Mike Carpenter. I'm the Managing Director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania. We have three wonderful panelists here to discuss the topic of Ukraine. Seated to my left, Hanna Hopko, who is chair of the Rada's Foreign Affairs Committee in the last session of the Rada. Svitlana Zalishchuk, to her left, who is also a member of the same committee from a different political party. And we have former Foreign Minister Boris Tarasyuk, also a member of the Rada in the last session. So three former MPs, all representing different political parties. What better combination of speakers to talk about what's happening in Ukraine today? So what I would like to do with this discussion is I will moderate and ask a few questions. I'm going to leave time for questions from the audience afterwards, so you can start thinking about them already now. But I'm going to start by building on the frame that Prime Minister Yatsenyuk just laid out in terms of what the priorities for this new government in Ukraine are, right? President Zelensky just won a massive election victory with 73% of the vote by campaigning essentially on three crucial issues for Ukrainians. One, fighting corruption and the system of oligarchy within Ukrainian political and economic spheres. Two, improving the economy, growing jobs, putting the economic path on a direction of growth and sustainability. And then three, ending the war in the Donbass and dealing with Russian aggression. So let's dive into those three topics. I think we're going to go sort of sequentially through those. I'll start maybe with the topic of anti-corruption. There have been obviously some new people brought in to the cabinet who have this mandate. There are, of course, also anti-corruption institutions in Ukraine that are a carryover from the previous administration. So you have the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and its director, Artem Sitnik, who remains in office. You have the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor. You have an agency for the prevention of corruption. But in the Prosecutor General's office, we have some new faces. We have Ruslan Ryaboshabka, we have Chumak, we have Vitaly Kasko, we have others. Svitlana, let me start with you. What is your assessment of the new team and their approach to fighting corruption? What can you tell us based on your initial impressions?
Thank you, Michael, for this question. First of all, a disclaimer. I will be answering this question in the capacity of a jobless politician who just lost its seat 2 months ago in the parliament. However, I will be also answering this question in a capacity not just as an independent observer, but a responsible Ukrainian citizen who is speaking in front of this honorary audience. And apparently, I think you came here to find out what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on with internal reforms, what's going on with the fight in the sphere of corruption, because, in my mind, it's a fundamental brick of our relationship with the European and Euro-Atlantic community in the sphere of security, and it is also have its implications on the perspectives of the solution in Donbass and also how to get back Crimea. So that's my perspective of how I'm going to answer this question. In brief, I'm cautiously optimistic. Why? First of all, we have new General Prosecutor Office. It's a man who has a good reputation. He also hired just a few Deputy General Prosecutor who also have clean reputation, and I would say that people put a lot of expectations from the new team. And if you ask where is this core of corruption was, you know, in the whole internal system of governance, I would say that it was a General Prosecutor Office. The office who had to investigate people, whatever positions they took in Ukrainian power. Secondly, I'd like to touch upon our government. I believe that the new government is the cleanest and also have to be said probably the youngest governments we've ever had in the history of Ukraine. And it gives us a lot of hope. Next, it's anti-corruption court. A couple years ago, we managed to adopt anti-corruption court, with jurisdiction is to investigate corruption on the highest level in the country. It just started its job. For a number of years, judicial system in Ukraine ignored or sabotaged those several hundred biggest cases in Ukraine, which were actually, to the knowledge of our audience, of course, you were following it in press. And I think that it also gives us additional hope that these cases will be prosecuted and impunity not gonna be anymore the synonymous of the Ukrainian governance. Next one is National Agency on Preventing of the Corruption. It's a special institution in the anti-corruption infrastructure of Ukraine that had to look into the assets of our politicians and also public servants. It had nothing to do with its name during the last 5 years, I had to say, despite of the all beautiful declarations from the leaders of Ukraine. Just yesterday, there has been adopted the new legislation that has to reset the whole team, the new team, and once again, it will be done in the similar way of how anti-corruption court was created. And it's additional argument of why we believe that Zelensky team, Honcharuk, Prime Minister's team, is going to do better with the corruption than the previous team. And the last point is judicial system, of course. It's unfortunately the denominator, you know, of all of the efforts and all of the reforms in any democratic country. And in Ukraine, it was not a successful case. Judicial system in Ukraine needs a good reset. And this is what we've heard from Mr. President, that he's going to do that. So far, I can't assure you that everything's gonna be fine. We haven't seen the draft laws, we haven't seen the initiatives, but we've heard the declaration and the promises that it's gonna be done. So I'm, as you, as all friends of Ukraine, is waiting for that.
Great. Well, thank you, Svitlana. Let me pick up on that point of the judiciary as I turn to Boris Tarasyuk. This has always been the weakest point in the anti-corruption system. You need to have a chain of politically independent institutions to launch investigations and then to prosecute them. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you can have wonderful investigators, you can have very competent prosecutors, but if the courts are not independent of political influence, corruption does not get prosecuted. And there have been very few high-level cases of corruption that have been prosecuted in Ukraine since the Revolution of Dignity. And this was really one of the primary impetuses for people to show up on the streets in 2014, was getting rid of the system of the past. So as you look at the judicial reform, and especially the Supreme Council of Justice, there were some, at least in the media, it was portrayed that some of the appointments, both at the end of President Poroshenko's tenure, but maybe also some of the new appointments, are questionable. I don't know, I'm an outsider, so let me ask you, how do you evaluate the reform of the judiciary? Are you confident that things are on the right track, or what's your view?
Yes, I would like to continue what just Svitlana said, that we had, for a couple of years, different anti-corruption bodies which were not producing the result. And the problem was that the leadership of the country, the previous leadership of the country, in fact led to the discreditation of those anti-corruption bodies, who started to fight one another instead of fight the corruption. So there is a clear determination from the new authorities to give a new impetus to the work of anti-corruption bodies. And by the way, the new anti-corruption court started functioning. I think that with the new authorities, with the absence of people in the government or around the president being interested in corruption, we have the new chance in Ukraine to, to fight the corruption effectively and with the result, which was not the case before. So I think that we have everything necessary to give a new, so to say, face of fighting the corruption effectively. And I hope it will be the case with the new appointments and the new authorities. Thank you.
Thanks. So those are two fairly optimistic readings of the new team and their intentions in terms of fighting corruption. But let me turn to you, Hanna, because at the heart of the issue of corruption in Ukraine, well, aside from petty corruption, is the issue of oligarchs and the influence especially that oligarchs have in political life. Because if you concentrate economic resources to such a degree that you can control television stations and finance political campaigns, then your economic power spills over into the political arena, and then the political arena can be used in turn to shape favorable economic conditions for those oligarchs that are invested in certain sectors of the economy. In Ukraine right now, I think the number one person that people are talking about in this regard is Ihor Kolomoisky. He has a relationship with President Zelensky that stretches back apparently many years. He has recently had a very public meeting with the president that was conveyed to the media. And there are a number of members of the president's team who have ties to Mr. Kolomoisky. From your vantage, do you think that this influence, pernicious influence of oligarchs in Ukraine can be dealt with successfully by this team? Are you skeptical? What should we, the international community, what should we be looking for to judge whether this issue is dealt with appropriately and once and for all so that this pernicious influence is cut?
Thank you, Mike, for these important questions. I think the West should not be just observing, but helping Ukraine. And for example, Firtash case, for more than 3 years, it's hard for the United States to conduct an extradition of Mr. Firtash to the US. And we know for sure that Mr. Firtash is one of the key oligarch, pro-Russian oligarch, involved in many corrupted schemes in energy sector. And it's really important for us because now Ukraine, together with Poland and with the United States, we expect to see new sanctions to be imposed against Nord Stream 2. We consider this project as an existential threat for Ukraine. This is why also taking into account that Ukraine possesses the third largest natural gas reserves in Europe after Russia and Norway. So I think the new government, they have all instruments to develop a very competitive gas market. And actually when Ukraine could become exporter of gas, not just importer. And actually this is our way of energy independence, and this is what after Dignity Revolution, we started the government of Arseniy Yatsenyuk not to buy directly gas from Russia, but trying to fix this problem through reverse gas, but also increasing the gas extraction in Ukraine. So I think this is where there's a mutual cooperation when Ukraine expects from the West. Talking about Mr. Kolomoisky, of course, he is not just Ukrainian citizens. He has also the passport of the EU citizenship and other countries. So my question to the EU member states, why he was given the citizenship and received some protection? So I think here, when we are talking about the oligarchy, not just Mr. Kolomoisky, also another Mr. Pinchuk, Mr. Akhmetov, and all these Ukrainian oligarchs, they are very smart in buying loyalty from Western political elites by inviting them to different security or not security, like Yalta European Strategy conferences and others, talking about happiness now, like this annual conference happened just recently in Kiev. So I think for Zelensky, knowing that Ukrainian oligarchs, they are the owners of the most powerful, the most popular TV channels, he has to maneuver how to avoid the scenario when all oligarchs will have the collusion against Mr. Zelensky. And without Western support, without investigation of all this money laundering, all these corrupted schemes, and I think the West has the real instrument how to help Mr. Zelensky, if he has this political will finally to demonopolize different sectors, important sectors like energy sector, for example. And also, I think we have to talk about also de-oligarchization, not just Ukrainian economy, but also de-oligarchization of foreign policy. And it's probably not just about Ukraine. The influence of the oligarchs on, crooked people, corrupted guys on decision-making process. So I think this is really important, and when we mention economic growth as one of the key goal for Ukraine, why we need economic growth? Because Ukraine is really important to see the middle class growing, because the populists, they are flourishing when they see poor people. So this is why I hope that the new government will keep focusing on like privatization and other reforms to see how the life of people is improving, and people will not trust the populists, but will with critical mindset analyze what they are proposing. And also Ukraine proved that we are a mature democracy after presidential election, then snap parliamentary elections. And we have to keep in mind that next year there is another important elections, local elections. And we started one of the key reform, decentralization reform, because this is a real anti-corruption reform. When we destroy this vertical power, when local communities were dependent from Kyiv, from national level, and it also creates a lot of opportunities for corruption. So I do believe that a new government will continue reforms we started. Besides decentralization, there is also education reform, pension reform, healthcare reform. If you look at healthcare sector, it's also, we introduced the public procurement through international organizations like World Health Organization. This is another way how to tackle corruption and all these corrupted schemes. So I think, and also demonopolize this sector. So there are different ways how to demolish the oligarchic influence on economy, on decision-making process, but the keys here are also to support free media. And we voted several years ago to establish public broadcasting in Ukraine, but still we need more financial investment to make this public broadcasting TV and radio more professional, to compete with oligarchic TV channels, plus now the access to the social media, Facebook and others, is growing. And this is another way when one day the politicians will be less dependent on oligarchs as the owners of TV channels.
Thank you. So, Minister Tarasiuk, Hanna just mentioned decentralization reform, which I would agree was one of the most successful reforms of the last administration. Healthcare reform. You have a very competent finance minister, Makarova, in place who understands what's needed to maintain fiscal and monetary balance. The president has talked about land reform, which is a crucial thing in order to spur the economy in Ukraine. So there's a lot of positive developments that seem to be occurring in the economic space. But at the same time, the IMF is very focused on one issue, well, many issues, I would say, but there's one that's controversial in Ukraine, and that is the case of PrivatBank, which was nationalized in the last administration. Do you see any danger of PrivatBank nationalization being undone? Could this blow up, for example, the IMF loan that's currently being discussed, or do you think that that's not an issue at the current moment?
Well, I think that the renationalization of PrivatBank will be very dangerous precedent, and I hope that neither the president nor the all appropriate authorities in Ukraine, especially judiciary, will be ready to make this very destructive decision to return PrivatBank into the private hands. I think that this will undermine the whole banking system in Ukraine. And speaking about those issues, including the fighting corruption, I cannot but mention the reform of judiciary. Different governments, different presidents were trying to bring this reform into reality, but unfortunately they failed. And now the new president and his new majority in the parliament are discussing the new judiciary reform. And right now, these hours in Ukraine, in Kyiv, there is a discussion about the reform of judiciary along the lines of the proposals made by the president concerning the reform of Supreme Court of Ukraine. And the package of amendments to the legislation is lacking some elements and are being criticized from outside. That, for example, from 200 members of the Supreme Court, it is proposed to diminish until 100. So this is one of the weakest points in this proposal about the reform of judiciary. And coming back to, because this issue of reform of judiciary is closely connected with the private bank fate, and I think that without deep and comprehensive reform of judiciary, it is impossible to expect fair decisions by the Ukrainian courts, including as to the private bank. Thank you.
Thanks. Svitlana, one of the things that has frustrated me the most working on defense issues with Ukraine has been the incredible potential of Ukraine's defense industry. You make systems from helicopter engines to rockets to armored personnel carriers and everything in between. It's really a very strong industrial base. And yet its potential, I think, is only a fraction of what it could be. And corruption, but also structural impediments have been part of the reason why it has not attracted Western investment in the ways it could. Now, former Minister of Economy Aivaras Abromovicius is both the CEO and chairman of the board of Ukroboronprom, which I see as a very positive development. But then on the other side, just recently we had Alexander Daniliuk resigning from the position of National Security and Defense Council head. Do you see things moving in a positive direction? Do you think there's now a basis for being optimistic about the possibility for Western investment in Ukraine's defense industry?
Thank you for this question. You already said it that Mr. Abramovicius, who was one of the most promising ministers in the previous government and who actually left the government because there was some corruption initiatives from the close circle of the former president, and actually Poroshenko paid the price. I think that the corruption in the defense sphere was one of the those blows that took away the seat under him, and he lost the elections. So now with the new leadership in Ukroboronprom, the defense sphere, the biggest defense enterprises in Ukraine, it gives the hope that it gives the right signals to the investors, to the business in the world. Secondly, I'd like to mention also the new Minister of Defense, Andriy Zagorodnyuk, who also has a good reputation in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, and they prepared a program of the defense reform which was claimed to be in line and fully compatible with the NATO standards. I have to say as well that just a couple days ago the Prime Minister Honcharuk published the government program, and one of the goals of the program is in 5 years to be fully compatible with the NATO alliance, which gives us, of course, hope. And it is impossible to do without fighting corruption in the defense sphere, first. And secondly, it is also impossible to stop the war and to stop the conflict and to counteract Russian aggression. It is impossible to convince soldiers to give their lives and to risk with their health, while at the same time they would see that money are being stolen by Ukrainian leaders. So I think it's a very interdependent things as well.
Thank you, and I'm glad you mentioned Minister Zagorodnyuk, because I was always impressed by him when he was in the ministry as one of the most articulate advocates of defense reform and NATO interoperability within the Ukrainian defense system. I'd like to shift gears a little bit now on what, not so much, it's a good segue into the next topic, which is the war in the Donbass and the negotiations that surround it. And it seems like this area is moving very quickly, that President Zelensky is capitalizing on his political popularity to push forward with negotiations on the Donbass. The talk of the town everywhere is the Steinmeier formula, which, for those of you who are not familiar, essentially entails the holding of elections. It takes two elements of the Minsk Agreement of February 2015, the holding of elections in the Russian-occupied Donbass and special status for the Russian-occupied Donbass, and links them in a sort of a quid pro quo. What do you make of this? What is your impression, Hanna, of the wisdom of following the Steinmeier formula? Are there risks inherent in it? Is it possibly a solution to the war? Is this how we get peace in Donbass?
We need victory over Russian aggression, and actually I agree. The key goal of Ukraine is to restore territorial integrity and sovereignty, which includes taking back Donbass and Crimea. So in 2016, when was the last meeting on Normandy for leaders, it was agreed that security first. Even Putin agreed to this vision. So I don't understand why now we have to shift to the political track of Minsk agreement when there is no security, there is no ceasefire. And even the first step what President Zelensky made, like this engagement part, and also building the bridge in Stanitsa Luganska, I also could say that this is a part of compromise from Ukrainian side, because how we could conduct this engagement when there is no ceasefire, and when everyday people now living in the gray zone asking who will guarantee the security for them? Who? OSCE General Secretary. I would like to invite him to go with me to Donetsk or Lugansk and to see if the security for pre-electoral period is ready to conduct elections. So Mogherini, she never visited Eastern Ukraine, never. Macron, who wants to conduct Europeization of Russian Federation to Vladivostok. And I have a question, who will be faster? Mr. Putin with his expansion of Ruski Mir to La Manche, or Macron with his Europeization of Russian Federation to Vladivostok? So I think the history knows the answer. And let's not be naive, let's not have illusions, because the Putin's goal towards Ukraine is the same, to take Ukraine back under the sphere of Russian influence, because without Ukraine, Putinism, they cannot rebuild their empire. Ukraine is crucially important for Putin's goal. Not Georgia, not Moldova, not Belarus and others, just Ukraine. So this is why when we are talking about the success of Ukraine, and Ukraine is on the track to success, so I truly believe that the successful Ukraine matters for European Union, for NATO, and also for Russian Federation. Because I think people now suffering in Russia, just remember this act of self-burning of scientists in Udmurtia, because the Udmurtia language is disappearing. Macron, who delivered a speech to his ambassadors, and in the part of his speech was about the humanism of Europe, but he never made a statement about this act and about human rights violation in the territory of Russian Federation. So maybe do not talk about humanism in Russian Federation, in Europe, and let's really keep focusing on what's going on in Russia and not return Russian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe without implementation of any obligations. So I can imagine that President Zelensky, he really wants to see some progress. But let's start from the beginning. After Ilovaisk, Debaltseve, Ukraine at that time was economy in decline, no army. So now we have one of the strongest army at the European continent. We have economy in the dynamics of growth, not in 10% of GDP decline like it used to be in 2015. So actually now, President Zelensky, but the only difference that unfortunately, the transatlantic solidarity and unity now is not so strong as it used to be 3-4 years ago. But this is not the case to follow the trap which is in the Steinmeier's formula and others. And why I mentioned the security first. Because, look, Russia has killed Minsk several times by expropriation of Ukrainian companies at temporary occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, by recognition of documents like driver license, so-called DNR and LR. And this year, Russia announced this passportization, not just the citizens of occupied territories, but the whole Ukraine. So Russia is killing Minsk every day. And in return, Ukraine has to make some steps to show that we are ready for peace, not Russia. And another very important, every year, annually, Ukrainian parliament with the big debates, and Boris Tarasyuk and Svitlana never supported this. So we were really fighting within the Committee on Foreign Affairs, within the parliament, how to continue the special status law. And the argument that Kurt Volker, that G7 ambassadors and others every time just was provided for us, we need to keep sanctions. Look, not allow Russians to blame Ukraine. You should vote for this law. You should vote for this law. Okay, from 2016, 2017, 2018, every year the Parliament of Ukraine proved that we are a reliable partner for our Western allies, and we want peace, but not at the sake of our national interest and the sovereignty of Ukraine. Because Putin has his key goal, first, instead of decentralization, federalization of Ukraine, autonomy for Donbass, just to block Ukrainian course towards course for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Sorry, this is not in the interest of our future. And yesterday at Bankova Street, there was a big protest, just a call for Mr. Zelensky not to follow this trap. And I hope that Mr. Zelensky will improve his communications, and since Ukraine is a true democracy, he will find time and his people to explain MPs, also to explain experts and Ukrainians what he means, because the devil's in details. So it's really important to have more information. But I think after more than 13,000 of lives killed in eastern Ukraine, in Russian aggression against us, so I think we deserve not to follow this trap, but to expect from our Western allies, with all their ideas, like Germany with Nord Stream 2, Macron with his idea of dialogue with Putin, domestic problems in US like elections, presidential, that the West finally will understand that success of Ukraine, it's a part of success of the Western civilization.
Thank you. Svitlana, when Kurt Volker was first appointed as the special envoy of the United States to Ukraine, he was speaking every day about a peacekeeping operation for the Russian-occupied Donbass. I don't hear anyone talking about a peacekeeping operation anymore, but I do hear people talking about holding elections. As someone whose country was attacked 2 years ago in our last presidential elections, where the Russians interfered to support one of their preferred candidates, and with considerable success, I can't imagine how much success Russia would have in interfering into elections that were held in a region that they occupied in the absence of either a peacekeeping operation or some greater form of Ukrainian control. What are the modalities? How can you hold elections in a region where you've got foreign troops? Is it possible?
It's not possible. And talking about peacekeeping operation, it's not about how much there is a discussion about it, right? It's about Russian veto at the Security Council. It's about Security Council being a hostage of Russia, as well as many other solutions in the world and conflicts in the world. We are talking about the creation of the tribunal for MH17. It was blocked by Russian veto. A resolution on the attack of Russians on the civilians with the chemical attack on civilians in Syria, it was blocked. It's being blocked by Russia, and so on and so forth. So we are not the only hostages, we are not the only victims from Russian veto at the Security Council. But I'd like to touch upon an external also perspective in this Donbass situation and Crimea situation in war in Ukraine. I was listening yesterday to Dalia Grybauskaitė, former president of Lithuania, with a sadness. Why with the sadness? Because it's very rare now that a European leader talks about aggression without dressing it into some fluid metaphor and a necessity to, you know, shift the paradigm towards the potential dialogue with the Russian president. So her voice was kind of a unique amongst those European and world leaders. And that only underlines that, in fact, what's happening is that the master plan about the future of the rule-based order of the world shared between good guys is disappearing, doesn't exist anymore. And it's not only Putin who is the problem for Ukraine, who is problem for Syria, who is problem for MH17, Iran, and other, Georgia, you name it, US elections, other European elections, but it's also us. It's about liberal Democrats that help him to create those problems, that help him to keep Donbass and Crimea in this status quo. And let's take Macron, that Hanna has mentioned already, and his reset policy with Putin. We have witnessed it already by American president. The history didn't teach us that actually it leads only to the further invitation of Putin to impose his aggression at the expense of sovereign and independent countries. It's about Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that is being implemented with, of course, an invitation and support of German government, which completely destroys and changes the whole energy security in the region. In the end, I'd like you to look at Donbass not as an internal situation, right? Of course, many people share the view that it's an international conflict, but many people also think about it as if it's let Ukraine deal with it, and because we have other problems as well. In fact, if Donbass is being reintegrated at Russian conditions, and it will become a pro-Russian enclave within Ukraine, I believe it will shift the balance of the power in the region. If the trajectory from 1991 was moving us to the extension of the European security economic space, right, in our region, now with Donbass being reintegrated at Russian conditions, it will extend Russian influence in the region again. Having Georgian problems, having Moldovan problems, it will bring back the legitimate sphere of Russia to many square kilometers, which would create, I believe, a problem not for just next year or 2 years, but for next decade or decades, for the whole world, for US, for EU to pay for it and to deal with it. So it is not just in Ukrainian interests, it's an interest of the whole Euro-Atlantic and European community to make sure that we have Ukrainian Donbass and Ukrainian European Donbass. Thank you.
Thank you. So we started late. I think hopefully I'll be allowed to go about 10 minutes over. I want to ask one last question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So start thinking of your questions now. But Boris Tarasiuk, so I just want to ask you to pick up on the very clear presentation that Svitlana just made about the dangers inherent in special status. But the special status law expires at the end of this year, so the Rada will have to come up with some sort of new legislation on this. Can you envisage a status for the occupied Donbass that would not threaten Ukraine's sovereignty in the way that Svitlana has just described?
Well, I see a real danger in what is now being discussed on the official level, and at the same time we see the concern being caused by these discussions among the society. The result of this concern was the rallies which were organized yesterday in Maidan and close to the presidential office. So this is a very dangerous situation, which right from the negotiations, the public opinion is not being aware. So talking about the Steinmeier formula and Minsk arrangement. By the way, there are no Minsk agreements. There are Minsk arrangements composed of 3 documents separate, 2 of September 2014, 1 of February 2015. And these documents, if you read them carefully, are proving that they are badly composed from the legal standpoint. And Steinmeier formula, to my mind, is not understandable because if you read Steinmeier formula, it is lacking the clear answers to the questions. Is it possible to have the elections under the barrels of Russian troops, of separatists? Is it possible to have the elections when the region is being packed with military with rifles and sophisticated weapons? It is impossible. Is it possible to have the fair local elections without the control until the Ukrainian-Russian border? It is impossible to imagine. So we understand that the formula which is being repeated again and again, that the local elections in Donbass should be conducted under and according to Ukrainian legislation and the standards of OSCE. But how one can achieve this? And to my mind, the authorities are not very clear in explaining how this Steinmeier, so to say, Steinmeier formula will work. Now about the peacekeeping operation, possible peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, I think that I do not see the perspective of having peacekeeping operation because Russia on one side, Ukraine and our friends on the other side are having a different views on the peacekeeping operation. Russia would like to consolidate with the presence of peacekeeping forces, UN peacekeeping forces, the current dividing line. Ukraine and our friends, we are favoring the peacekeeping forces being spread over the whole occupied territory of Donbass. And I would like to finish with saying that the very dangerous and well, with the great attention of the public opinion in Ukraine, these negotiations may become a starting point for the end of the war and the beginning of settlement. And at the same time, it may become a booster for the public disobedience. So there's a great danger, and the authorities have to be very clear, well, and attentive to the public concerns which is being demonstrated.
Okay, I'm told we have 5 minutes, so we're going to speak very quickly. We'll take 3 very quick questions. Please, only a question, no comments, and then we'll let the speakers address them. Right there, lady at the end of the row.
Thank you very much. I'm Christina Pushal with the New Security Leaders Delegation. Until earlier this year, I sensed a lot of hesitation from Ukraine's many supporters and friends in Washington to criticize the Poroshenko administration for its shortcomings on anti-corruption reform. Today, of course, that has changed. I did see some very fair criticism at this forum. But also today, I saw a statement from Poroshenko's party that there would be a criminal case opened against the former president. This could be seen as a step backward in terms of political culture, or a step forward in terms of accountability and de-oligarchization and justice. So I'm wondering how you see it.
Thank you. Okay, gentleman right here in the second row.
Well, one of the curses of the Ukrainian Rada were transfers of MPs from one fraction to another. What do you think? What is your assessment of the proposal which is under discussion to freeze the situation and simply link the potential transfer of somebody from one fraction to another with sort of resignation from the seat in the parliament?
Okay, and then right there, please.
Thank you, Andras Sedei from Hungary, CFPA. My question is that what do you think the new administration will be able to renegotiate a transit agreement, gas transit agreement with Russia, or are we looking forward to a very cold winter in Central and Eastern Europe?
Thank you. Let's start with Ms. Hopko.
I'll start from the last question, from transit. Start from last question on gas transit. So, so far we do not see a constructive position from Russian side in these trilateral talks in Brussels. But Ukraine, of course, demand from Russia to pay, according to the Stockholm arbitrage, to pay money to us. And of course, we will not sign the agreement which Russia proposed, which will be against our interest. And we will continue to advocate within the US Congress to impose sanctions because for this year, Russia depends on Ukraine gas transition system. But after the Nord Stream 2, when it will be built, of course, then the situation might change.
Ms. Zalishchuk.
I'll briefly answer the question on the imperative mandate, right? In my personal opinion, I don't believe that it's a very democratic practice, and I don't support such a law. I think that these shifts of the parliamentarians from one party to another party can be solved with the development of the political culture, right? And elections should be punishment for people that choose these shifts based on certain political, I don't know, favors or something like that. And I don't think that at the moment there is a support in Ukrainian parliament for this legislation.
Mr. Tarasiuk, you have the last word.
Yeah, I'll try to answer the question about fighting corruption again. Indeed, 11 cases are being raised against former President Poroshenko, and the State Bureau of Investigation are dealing with these issues. So let's wait and see what will come out of these investigations. But I think that in addition to the anti-corruption bodies, without the deep and clear and understandable reform of judiciary as a whole, it would be impossible to expect the results. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're well over time. Please join me now in thanking our speakers for a wonderful discussion.
And our moderator.